Every parent knows the routine: bath time, pajamas, and then that magical moment when you open a colorful storybook filled with princesses, talking animals, and happy endings. But what if I told you those bedtime stories weren't originally meant for children at all? The fairy tales we think we know, Cinderella, Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, are actually watered-down versions of brutal medieval accounts. Disney and the Brothers Grimm polished them into harmless fantasies, but in truth they were born from crime reports, survival manuals, and cautionary legends. Behind every once upon a time hides a real disaster, a murder, or a tragedy so disturbing that people turned it into a story to keep their communities alive. The talking wolves were serial killers. The wicked stepmothers were actual poisoners. And these tales carried body counts. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting fairy tales. They were documenting crime scenes. Case 1. The Pied Piper of Hamelin Imagine, June 26, 1284. In the small German town of Hamelin, families are preparing dinner as the sun sets. Suddenly, every parent realizes the same horrifying truth. Their children are gone. Not missing. Gone. All of them. 130 children between the ages of 4 and 14 vanished without a trace. This wasn't folklore. The records still exist, etched into church windows, written in town chronicles, preserved by medieval scribes who couldn't explain what they had witnessed. Hamelin nearly collapsed overnight. Its population dropped, its economy withered, and families abandoned their homes, unable to live in a place where their children had disappeared into thin air. And here's the chilling part. The original story had nothing to do with rats. That detail was added centuries later to make the tale less terrifying for children. The earliest accounts only describe a stranger in colorful clothes who led the children away with strange music, and they were never seen again. Historians have argued over what happened. Some believe the children were recruited for a crusade and died on the journey. Others thought they were taken east to populate new settlements. The darkest theory suggests they were drowned together in the nearby river during some kind of ritual. But what makes this story truly terrifying is the precision of the date. Medieval people rarely recorded exact days unless something earth-shattering had happened. The fact that June 26, 1284 was burned into memory means this was no ordinary tragedy. Even today, Hamelin has a street called the Street Without Drums, where no music is allowed to be played, because legend says it was the very path the children took on their final walk out of town. Picture this. A forest so dense the sunlight can barely pierce through the canopy. The ground is wet, roots twisting like veins, and the silence is broken only by the sound of 2 starving children dragging their feet deeper into the unknown. Their names? Hansel and Gretel. You might remember their story as a simple fairy tale about clever kids outsmarting a witch. But the original versions weren't meant to comfort anyone. They were survival horror. You don't learn this in school, but Hansel and Gretel was born during times of famine in medieval Europe. When food ran out, families were faced with impossible choices. Some even abandoned their own children to save themselves. That's the grim reality hidden beneath this tale. The parents, often softened into a wicked stepmother in later versions, weren't villains from a fantasy. They were reflections of real desperation. Imagine the horror of being a child, realizing your own parents might leave you to die in the woods just to survive another day. And then comes the witch. On the surface, she's a fantasy monster living in a house made of candy and bread. But think deeper. Her home isn't just sweet, it's a trap, a lure, a predator's bait designed to attract starving children. In the original versions, the witch isn't a quirky old woman. She's a cannibal. She fattens Hansel like livestock, locking him in a cage, and forces Gretel to do chores until the day of slaughter. The oven she prepares isn't for baking bread. It's for cooking children. This isn't whimsical. This is raw, primal terror. And here's the chilling part. Historians believe this story echoed real events. During times of famine, tales of cannibalism haunted communities. The witch's oven may have been a way to process that collective fear, the nightmare that hunger could turn humans into monsters. But the horror doesn't stop there. In some of the earlier oral traditions, Hansel and Gretel don't escape cleanly. Sometimes the witch succeeds. Sometimes the children never make it out of the forest at all. The happy ending we know today? That was added later to soften the blow, just like in Red Riding Hood. What this story really tells us is something brutal about human history. Hunger doesn't just empty stomachs. It empties morality. It forces people into choices so dark, we had to wrap them in fairy tales to even speak about them. Hansel and Gretel isn't just about breadcrumbs and candy houses. It's about starvation, abandonment, and the monstrous things people do when survival is on the line. So the next time you hear the story, don't think of it as a children's tale. Think of it as a window into a past where the scariest monsters weren't wolves or witches. They were people driven to the edge. We all know the story of Snow White, a girl with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as night. She's hunted by her jealous stepmother, saved by 7 dwarfs, and awakened by a prince's kiss. That's the Disney version. The real tale? It's drenched in blood, jealousy, and ritualistic horror. You don't learn this in school, but in the earliest versions collected by the Brothers Grimm, the evil queen doesn't just want Snow White gone. She wants her organs. When the queen orders the huntsman to kill Snow White, she demands proof. But not just any proof. She asks for the girl's lungs and liver. These aren't trophies. She plans to eat them. Think about that for a moment. This isn't a story about vanity. It's about cannibalism. The queen believes consuming Snow White's flesh will grant her beauty, youth, and power. This isn't fantasy. It echoes real medieval superstitions, where eating the body of the young was thought to restore vitality. The huntsman, of course, can't bring himself to kill the girl. Instead, he kills a boar and delivers its organs to the queen, and she doesn't hesitate. She eats them, believing she's consumed her stepdaughter. That's not children's story material. That's horror, but the nightmare doesn't end there. Snow White flees into the forest, and the queen's obsession only deepens. The mirror keeps reminding her the girl is alive. The disguises she uses to kill Snow White aren't playful tricks. They're brutal assassination attempts. First, a bodice laced so tightly it nearly crushes the girl's ribs. Then, a poisoned comb driven into her scalp. And finally, the infamous poisoned apple, half red, half white, symbolic of beauty and death in one bite. And here's something darker. In earlier versions, the dwarfs don't immediately save her. Snow White is left in a coma-like state for so long that she's kept in a glass coffin not because she looks peaceful, but because her body won't decay. Almost like she's preserved between life and death, a living corpse on display in the forest. And then comes the rescue. In Disney, the prince kisses her awake. But in the Grimm versions, it's not a kiss at all. The prince and his men are carrying her coffin when they stumble, jarring the apple piece loose from her throat. She wakes not because of love, but because of an accident. And the queen's fate? If you thought Snow White's revival was chilling, wait for this. At Snow White's wedding, the queen is forced to attend. But this isn't just humiliation. The punishment is torture. Heated iron shoes are brought out, glowing red from the fire. She's forced to wear them, and in front of the entire court, she dances until she collapses, dead. That's how the story ends. Not with a happily ever after, but with fire, flesh, and vengeance. Snow White isn't a fairy tale about beauty and love. It's a cautionary story about obsession, cannibalism, and the cruel fate awaiting those consumed by envy. The version we know is a sanitized fantasy. The real version? It's a nightmare preserved in ink. On the surface, Rumpelstiltskin looks like a quirky fairy tale. A strange little man helps a miller's daughter spin straw into gold, demands her firstborn as payment, and is eventually outsmarted when she learns his name. But peel back the polished layers, and what you find is a nightmare about power, desperation, and demonic deals. The story begins with a lie. The miller boasts to the king that his daughter can spin straw into gold. But this isn't a harmless exaggeration. It's a trap. The king isn't charmed, but he's greedy. He locks the girl in a room full of straw with a spinning wheel, and tells her plainly, "Spin this into gold, or you die." This isn't whimsical. It's coercion. A young girl, imprisoned, facing death for a crime she didn't commit. That's when he appears, Rumpelstiltskin, a shadowy figure part man, part monster. He offers her a way out, but not for free. First, he takes her necklace. The next night, her ring. And finally, when she has nothing left to give, he names his true price, her future child. And here's the unsettling truth. This isn't a fairy godmother swooping in to save her. It's a demon demanding tribute. Many folklorists believe Rumpelstiltskin is a remnant of older pagan myths about child sacrifice and bargains with dark spirits. The spinning of straw into gold may not be magic at all, but an allegory for transforming innocence into wealth, purity into corruption. The king, oblivious to the supernatural bargain, is thrilled. He marries the girl, not out of love, but out of greed for her supposed talent. She becomes queen, but the shadow of her promise hangs over her like a curse. When her first child is born, Rumpelstiltskin returns to collect his payment. Imagine the terror. A mother clutching her newborn while the creature she once bargained with comes to claim it. He gives her a chance. Guess his name within 3 days, and she keeps the child. Fail, and the baby is his. This isn't a game. It's psychological torture. The queen sends spies across the land, desperate for answers. And in the darkest version of the tale, she discovers him in the woods, dancing around a fire, chanting his own name in a grotesque ritual. Tonight I brew, tomorrow I bake, and soon the child is mine to take. The queen will never win this game, for Rumpelstiltskin is my name. It's here we see his true nature. He's not just a trickster. He's a predator, lured by innocence, celebrating the thought of stealing a child away. When the queen finally speaks his name, the story doesn't end neatly. In some versions, Rumpelstiltskin screams in rage and vanishes into smoke. But in the earliest tellings, his death is violent, almost grotesque. He stomps the ground so hard in fury that one leg sinks deep into the earth. With his rage uncontrollable, he grabs his other leg and rips himself in two. That's not a children's bedtime ending. That's body horror. Rumpelstiltskin is more than a fairy tale about cleverness. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when desperation leads you into dark bargains. The spinning wheel isn't a symbol of magic. It's a prison of fear. The gold isn't wealth, it's a curse. And the little man isn't a helper. He's a monster demanding a soul. The sanitized version tells us the queen outsmarts him. But the older versions tell us the truth. Rumpelstiltskin wasn't just a character. He was the embodiment of the most terrifying fear in human history, making a deal you can't escape. We all know the story. 2 children, abandoned in the forest, stumble upon a gingerbread house, only to be captured by a witch who plans to eat them. It's one of the most famous fairy tales ever told, but the truth hiding inside it is far darker than the sugary surface. At its core, Hansel and Gretel is not about candy. It's about famine. This tale was first whispered during the Great Famine of the 14th century, a time when starvation drove families to the brink of unthinkable choices. In many regions of Europe, there are recorded cases of parents abandoning children, or worse. That context transforms the story from a whimsical adventure into a survival horror. It begins with betrayal. Hansel and Gretel overhear their parents plotting to abandon them in the woods because they can no longer feed them. The children's innocence is shattered. The forest isn't just a setting, it's a death sentence. When they stumble upon the gingerbread house, it feels like salvation. Food when they need it most. But this house is a trap. Sweetness lures them in, but rot hides inside. The witch is no kindly grandmother. She is hunger personified. She fattens Hansel, planning to feast on him, while forcing Gretel into slavery, making her cook meals that she herself is forbidden to eat. It's a twisted cycle of cruelty. Feed one child to kill him, starve the other to break her spirit. This imagery is rooted in real medieval fears. During famines, rumors spread of witches or cannibals lurking in the woods, preying on children. The gingerbread house wasn't just magical. It was bait, a monstrous lure promising nourishment in exchange for your life. The witch's obsession with fattening up. Hansel mirrors ancient rituals of sacrifice and even echoes accounts of real-world cannibalism during desperate times. She checks his finger daily, waiting for him to plump up, but Hansel outsmarts her, offering a bone instead of his hand. Blind with greed, the witch grows impatient and decides to kill him anyway. The climax is one of the most brutal moments in any fairy tale. Gretel is ordered to crawl into the oven, a massive iron chamber already burning hot. The witch plans to roast her alive, but Gretel turns the tables. She shoves the witch inside, slamming the door shut. And make no mistake, this isn't a cartoonish puff of smoke. In the original versions, the witch is burned alive. Flesh sizzling, screams echoing. The oven becomes her tomb. Gretel doesn't just escape. She commits an act of survival-driven violence. The child becomes executioner, and the story doesn't flinch away from that horror. When Hansel and Gretel escape with the witch's treasures, it's not a happy ending. It's trauma wrapped in gold. They've killed to survive. They've seen the worst humanity has to offer. Abandonment, hunger, cannibalism. This isn't a tale about sweets. It's a story born from starvation, blood, and fire. The gingerbread house wasn't built to delight children. It was built to warn them. In times of hunger, even the sweetest things can hide death. Forget the gentle princess kissed awake by a charming prince. The real origins of Sleeping Beauty are far more disturbing. The earliest version, written in the 1600s by Italian author Giambattista Basile, wasn't a love story at all. It was a nightmare. In his tale, a young woman named Talia pricks her finger and falls into a deep, death-like sleep. But instead of being rescued, she becomes a victim. A wandering king finds her lifeless body, and overcome by desire, assaults her while she's unconscious. She doesn't wake. She doesn't even move. Months later, still in her cursed sleep, Talia gives birth to twins. Only when one of the babies sucks the splinter from her finger does she finally awaken, to discover she's now a mother to children she doesn't remember conceiving. This wasn't fantasy. It was a reflection of grim medieval realities. Historical records reveal cases of women who fell into catatonic states due to illness, trauma, or what doctors of the time called sleeping sickness. These women were often kept alive in noble households, treated like fragile dolls, but also left vulnerable to predators who took advantage of their helpless condition. When pregnancies appeared, the blame was often shifted to supernatural causes, fairies, spirits, or even divine miracles. But the truth was darker. These women were victims of crimes they could never report. Basile didn't invent this horror. He was documenting whispers of real events that circulated in his world. The Sleeping Beauty we know today has been scrubbed clean of its cruel reality. The Disney version paints a picture of true love's kiss. But the original tale wasn't about romance or destiny. It was a warning about exploitation, power, and the horrifying things that can happen to the powerless when the world refuses to see them as human. Sleeping Beauty didn't wake up to love. She woke up to trauma. The Rapunzel we grew up with is remembered for her long golden hair and a charming prince climbing up her tower. But the original tale wasn't a romance. It was a brutal story about imprisonment, exploitation, and survival. In the earliest versions, Rapunzel isn't locked away because she's special. She's locked away as a punishment. Her parents had made a desperate bargain. In exchange for food during a famine, they promised their unborn child to a powerful sorceress. When the girl was born, she was taken and shut inside a tower with no doors or stairs, cut off from the world before she even had a chance to live. But what really makes this story disturbing is what that tower represented. In medieval Europe, young women were often hidden away by families or religious orders, locked in cloisters or confined to small chambers. Some were sold into servitude. Others were imprisoned by wealthy men who wanted to control them completely. Rapunzel's prison was less fantasy and more a reflection of real practices designed to keep women isolated, voiceless, and dependent. And the hair? In many cultures, hair symbolized power, youth, and sexuality. Rapunzel's long braids weren't just a ladder. They were a sign of her vulnerability. In some darker versions of the story, when she's discovered meeting a man, her captor cuts off her hair and banishes her to suffer in the wilderness. She's left alone, pregnant, and starving, an ending far from happily ever after. The Brothers Grimm later softened the tale, turning it into a love story about escape and freedom. But beneath the surface, Rapunzel remains a chilling record of how women were imprisoned and controlled, their bodies treated as bargaining chips and their lives dictated by the choices of others. The truth is, Rapunzel wasn't waiting for a prince. She was a victim of captivity, and her story was a warning about what happens when innocence is traded for survival. Rumpelstiltskin sounds like a strange fairy tale about spinning straw into gold and outsmarting a little trickster. But the real roots of this story lie in medieval terror, child sacrifice, impossible debts, and the crushing weight of greed. The tale begins with a lie. A poor miller, desperate to impress the king, claims that his daughter can spin straw into gold. The girl, powerless and voiceless, is thrown into a locked chamber and told she must perform this miracle or be executed. This wasn't fantasy. It mirrored real practices where peasants, especially women, were forced to take on impossible demands from rulers and landowners. Failure often meant torture or death. Enter the strange figure, Rumpelstiltskin. He offers to save her, but only for a price. First jewelry, then a ring, and finally, her firstborn child. This wasn't just a bargain in a story. It was a reflection of medieval contracts where desperate families often pledged children as payment for debts. Records across Europe describe children handed over to monasteries, labor camps, or worse, when their parents couldn't repay loans. The darkest part comes later. When the girl becomes queen and gives birth, Rumpelstiltskin returns to claim the child. She begs, bargains, and cries, but he refuses. In some original versions, there's no happy ending. The creature takes the baby and vanishes. In others, he only leaves when the queen discovers his secret name, exposing him and stripping away his power. The obsession with names wasn't random. In medieval belief, knowing someone's true name gave you control over them. This superstition appears in countless rituals, from witch trials to exorcisms. But in Rumpelstiltskin, the price of not knowing wasn't spiritual. It was the life of an innocent child. The brothers Grimm turned the story into a riddle, but the truth is darker. Rumpelstiltskin wasn't just a mischievous imp. He was the embodiment of debt, desperation, and the monsters that prey on the powerless. A reminder that in a world ruled by greed, the most vulnerable, women and children, were often the ones who paid the price. Bluebeard is often told as a dark fairy tale about a wealthy man with a forbidden room. But when you peel back the layers, it becomes something far more sinister. A story of murder, control, and the dangers women faced in a world that gave them no power. The tale begins with a man known for his enormous wealth and his terrifying blue beard. Despite his riches, women fear him. He marries a young bride, showering her with luxury, but with one condition. She can enter any room in his vast castle, except one. Curiosity wins, and when she opens the forbidden door, she discovers a nightmare. Bodies of his previous wives, murdered and hanging from hooks. This isn't just a story about disobedience. It reflects a very real history of men who controlled, abused, and even killed their wives. In medieval and early modern Europe, women were often treated as property. Marriage contracts gave husbands complete authority, and stories of serial wife killers weren't uncommon. Bluebeard is a fairy tale version of domestic horror. The forbidden room symbolized the dangers women faced in private spaces. Behind closed doors, abuse was invisible. And once a woman was married, she had little to no escape. Divorce was nearly impossible, and legal protection was almost non-existent. Some historians link Bluebeard to real figures, like Gilles de Rais, a 15th century French nobleman accused of unspeakable crimes, including the abduction and murder of children. Others see it as a warning tale, told to young girls: obey your husband or risk death. But beneath the surface, the story reveals something darker, the constant fear women carried, even in the safety of their own homes. In the end, Bluebeard plans to kill his new wife after discovering her disobedience. She delays him just long enough for her brothers to arrive and kill the monster. But the horror remains. The story is a chilling reminder that wealth and power often hid unspeakable cruelty, and that sometimes the scariest monsters are not supernatural at all, but human. It sounds like a children's story. Bright colors, a magical flute, and a man leading away rats. But peel back the fairy tale layer, and the Pied Piper of Hamelin becomes one of history's darkest mysteries. The legend begins in the German town of Hamelin in the year 1284. The town was overrun with rats, devouring food supplies, spreading disease, and driving the townsfolk to desperation. Then came a strange figure, a man in brightly colored clothes playing a pipe. He offered to rid the town of the rats for a price. The people agreed, and with his music, he led every rat out of Hamelin into the river, where they drowned. But when the piper returned for payment, the town refused. And that's when the story takes its horrifying turn. He raised his pipe again, this time not for rats, but for children. On June 26, 1284, as the records say, 130 children of Hamelin disappeared, gone forever. No one knows what really happened. Some theories suggest disease struck the children, and the story of the piper became a way to explain tragedy. Others believe they were recruited, or abducted, for a mass migration, perhaps to colonize new lands. Still, darker whispers claim something far more sinister, that the town itself was complicit in handing over its children for reasons lost to history. The most chilling part? This isn't just a fairy tale. Hamelin has an actual historical record from the 13th century that mentions the event. On the day of St. John and Paul, 130 children born in Hamelin were led away by a piper clothed in many colors. They disappeared at the place of execution near the Coppin Hill. Even today, Hamelin carries the weight of the story. Streets are marked where the children were last seen. No music is allowed in certain parts of town, out of respect for the lost. It's a fairy tale wrapped around a wound in history, one that still hasn't healed. The Pied Piper isn't just a story about paying your debts. It's a chilling reminder that entire generations can vanish without explanation, and that some mysteries remain unsolved for centuries. The image is iconic, a dark rider, cloaked in shadow, thundering through the night, with no head upon his shoulders. The Headless Horseman isn't just a campfire story. It's one of the most enduring and terrifying legends in Western folklore. The version most people know comes from Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, where the ghost of a headless Hessian soldier haunts a small New York village. But the roots of this figure stretch back far deeper into medieval Europe, where tales of headless riders were whispered across Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia. In German folklore, he was known as the Dullahan, a dark spirit who carried his own head under his arm, with eyes that glowed like fire. In Ireland, he was a harbinger of death, riding a black horse, his decapitated head smiling with a demonic grin. Wherever the horseman appeared, it was said someone nearby would soon die. But why a headless rider? Some historians link the legend to ancient Celtic myths, where decapitation was a symbol of punishment and dishonor. Others believe it came from the real horrors of war. During the Middle Ages, soldiers and mercenaries often faced brutal executions, their severed heads displayed as warnings. It's not hard to imagine how such gruesome sights burned themselves into the collective memory, becoming the seeds of ghostly legends. The American version, tied to the Revolutionary War, makes the story even darker. Hessian mercenaries really did fight and die on American soil. Some were decapitated by cannon fire in the chaos of battle. The idea of one of these headless soldiers rising from the grave to hunt the living gave birth to the terrifying specter that galloped through Sleepy Hollow. Even today, the Headless Horseman continues to ride in our imaginations. From Gothic literature to horror films, he embodies a primal fear, the unstoppable force of death itself. You can't reason with him. You can't see his face. You can only hear the pounding of hooves in the night, drawing closer and closer, until it's too late. The Headless Horseman isn't just a ghost story. He's a reminder that some horrors never rest. They ride with us, century after century.